Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. My name is Jesse Day. Before we get started, as always, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is an expert in the uranium sector and the founder of the Uranium Insider newsletter. It's Mr. Justin Huhn. Welcome back to the show.
Always good to see you, Jesse. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And I want to get started with the elephant in the room that is on many uranium investors' minds, and that is how much do you think the recent coup in Niger will affect uranium mining and exploration in that region? And do you think investors in companies in Niger should be worried right now?
That's an interesting question. I think the situation still remains very fluid. So it's hard for me to make any predictions based on where things are at now. It sounds like they're trying to move towards diplomatic discussions as far as the Niger military that's currently in power of the country and the ECOWAS, which is the economic, I don't remember exactly what it stands for, Western African Economic Consortium of countries, primarily led by Nigeria, that borders Niger. So they've made some veiled threats to Niger, to the Niger military junta, essentially giving them an ultimatum to leave the country by X date. That date already passed. Actually, it passed by more than a week, we have yet to see actual military conflict. So that's a good sign. It sounds like there's an easing of the borders, which is also a good sign. There's been mixed messaging coming from the junta. It sounds like. And ideally, they want to move towards having a democratic election as soon as possible. That's obviously a positive thing. But to answer the first part of your question, how much is it going to affect kind of the future of uranium mining in the country? Gun to my head, it probably won't. We've seen 5 coups in Niger since they've gained independence from France. And there's never been an interruption to uranium mining throughout any of those. Now, it's also always possible that this time it's different. But it's really hard to say at this point. It's an extremely poor country. It's one of the poorest, if not the poorest countries on the planet, possibly only worse in Haiti. And uranium mining is fundamental to the country. It's a primary export. It's a very large portion of their GDP. And they're going to need to continue to do that going forward. I mean, period, the end. How will that be governed? Well, I think that it would look really bad if the federal government Niger actually reneged on their existing agreements with both Orano and with a number of other developing companies in the country. So that would be GoVX and Global Atomic, and there's a couple of others with some exploration properties there. So I think it's unlikely that that's going to happen. More than likely, the existing agreements will be honored. More than likely, it will return to business as usual for the miners. What it looks like next week or next month, I have no idea. Who's going to end up in power? I have no idea. I'm not going to speculate on these things, but really kind of the 30,000 foot view is just, again, like this was, so Global Atomic's DASA, for example, is the closest to producing greenfield uranium mine. So by greenfield, I mean first production is yet to happen. They're developing the mine for its first ever production. There's plenty of brownfield restarts that are in various stages of restarting. There's other greenfield projects around the world that are many years away. You know, we've got some very high grade stuff in the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. Orano is developing ISR projects in Mongolia. The Uzbeks are expanding. There's new mines being developed all the time in Kazakhstan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this greenfield mine was expected to be producing in 2025. They have some existing contracts in place. So it really highlights just kind of the fragility of supply more than anything. And you never really know when you're going to have some kind of interruption. Although what you pretty much can guarantee is greenfield supply, regardless of the jurisdiction, is not going to come online on time, on budget. It just won't ever. It never has, it never will. And so, broader picture, the demand picture is just very, very solid, very stable, growing, relatively easy to model out. Supply picture has a whole bunch of question marks, and this is just another big question mark.
Well, I think that segues well into the next question, which is, as we sit here today, how do you view the health of the uranium sector? And what are you currently looking at in the sector that has you excited for the future?
Oh gosh, well, those are two pretty different questions. I mean, the health of the sector, I think that it's improving. and it's improving. And I'm specifically talking about the uranium mining sector and the various elements of the fuel cycle. So the actual production of the fuel, right? So that sector, I think the health of that sector is definitely improving. The Russian invasion of Ukraine certainly shook up the industry and continues to shake up the industry. And there's been a lot of occurrences since then within the nuclear fuel markets that have certainly shifted things dramatically from how they were even 2 years ago, but especially the previous decade. So we have the previous decade oversupply, dwindling prices across the fuel cycle. Uranium was cheap and abundant for utilities for a very, very, very long time. That has finally shifted, and it's done a complete 180. It's a seller's market. Prices have all risen substantially across the fuel cycle. And utilities are sort of running out of all of their flex options. And that's a very interesting dynamic. So over the past year to year and a half, what utilities have done, actually it's been going on longer than the invasion of Ukraine. So let's say 2 to 3 years. Utilities have generally recognize that we're in an uptrend. They recognize that prices are relatively expensive across the fuel cycle, especially compared to a few years ago. And rather than jump to enter into large new contracts, they're going to flex up those deliveries of uranium as they can. So if you signed a contract, let's say with Cameco in 2018 for partially fixed, partially market referenced, and the fixed price is at $40 a pound, you're going to get as much as you can out of that contract. And there was a lot of flex provisions in these contracts where they would allow utilities to choose to receive up to potentially 20% more than the original contracted amount. Sometimes the flex provisions can have to do with timeframes of delivery, but also quantity. So to the extent that they've been able to, utilities have generally flexed up their legacy contracts prior to entering en masse into the long-term contracting cycle. So the price recovery across the fuel cycle has definitely improved the health of all of the companies operating within uranium production, conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, et cetera. And that's what we need, is sustaining higher prices to get more of these development projects up and running, improve the supply picture, because even with all of the existing development projects around the world that we know of, we still have a supply shortfall based on projected demand picture going out into the later part of the decade, into the early 2030s.
So looking on the other side of the coin, are there any risks you see on the horizon or reasons for caution when it comes to the uranium sector at this point in time?
It's pretty hard to kind of come up with significant risks, just seeing where the wind is blowing here. The trend is moving towards nuclear. It's a tidal wave right now. It's really incredible to see. So very, very rarely are we seeing a story that goes against that trend. One of those would obviously be Germany. That's kind of the big one that we can highlight. That's obvious. There's a couple of elements like that, but that's the big one, is Germany shutting down all of their reactors. They closed their last 3 reactors in April of this year. Mark Nelson and his team at the Radiant Energy, they visited Germany recently. They determined that 8 of their reactors technically could still be restarted. So that's a big question. Will physics win out in the end in Germany? I don't know. I'm not holding my breath, but that's one of the stories on the negative side. But really, it's just an overwhelming shift and a ton of momentum moving towards the expansion and the adoption of nuclear energy in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. So it's difficult to come up with a bearish scenario. I think the big obvious one is there's always a potential of a nuclear accident, which almost guaranteed would affect sentiment for the short term. I'm sure they would affect the equity's performance at least for, a number of days or a number of weeks. And then depending on how that potential accident would shift the build out, the plans for nuclear within various countries, if it would actually affect demand like the Fukushima Daiichi disaster did. That accident caused a major hit to demand. And that's really what led to the bear market in the previous decade. I mean, that was the big catalyst for it, but there was expansion of supply and all of that too. So, but barring some kind of unexpected hit to demand, it's very difficult to see what could lead to even price stability, let alone lower prices for uranium in the near future. I don't really know what to say other than demand is stable and growing, and supply isn't. So it's pretty clear where uranium has to go. Even if most of the build outs that are happening currently are the planned reactor starts, planned construction starts going out for the next 10 years, if all of those got canceled, we're still going to see higher uranium prices based on the existing fleet.
Well, speaking of planned reactor builds, what are your thoughts on Sweden announcing plans to build at least 10 new nuclear reactors and taking this hard pivot into nuclear energy?
It's yet another example. I mean, Sweden shut down a perfectly good reactor, I think, 3 years ago. And so for them to do a complete 180 and talk about building 10 new reactors it's physics winning. I mean, really, they have a net zero plan. I think it was at 2045, if I recall correctly. So they want to produce zero carbon emissions with their electricity sector in the next 20 years. And they understand they cannot do it without nuclear. So it's not necessarily I believe in this technology, or nuclear is the future for X, Y, and Z reasons. It's just a recognition that they can't reach those goals without it. And so, yeah, we've seen, and all of the talking points coming from Sweden right now have been obvious for us for the last 5-6 years. Is, it's baseload, it's clean. Some of these advanced reactor designs, which, by the way, they are looking at large reactors as well as small modular reactors and advanced nuclear. So some of these advanced designs can actually cycle up and down significantly more easily, which makes them more appropriate for, working in conjunction with intermittent energy sources. So solar and wind, for example. If you have baseload energy, a lot of times the large scale nuclear reactors, they can't cycle up and down as quickly or as much as, let's say, coal or natural gas, or battery backups. But I think it's pretty well understood that grid scale battery storage is kind of a pipe dream, at least with technologies as it is now. So yeah, it's just, it's yet another country moving in that direction. It's funny. It's like this kind of news 2 or 3 years ago would be like, whoa, Sweden building 10 new nuclear reactors. That's incredible. And now it's just like, well, like every day I open up my email, I go on Twitter, I connect with my industry contacts. It's like, it's just snowball right now. It's gaining momentum. It's gaining size. And I mean, Uganda announced that the president has agreed with the terms with the South Koreans and the Russians to build 10 reactors in Uganda, 10, from 0 to 10. I don't even know what they're going to do with that much electricity other than probably sell it to neighboring countries, which maybe that's their plan. If they can build out stable baseload that'll last 60 or 80 years and they can sell it to all the neighboring countries, that's going to do an enormous amount of good for the GDP of the country of Uganda. So that one really blew me away. But yeah, crazy.
You recently posted a list on Twitter as well of countries looking to implement or expand on nuclear. It was quite a long list. So aside from the countries we've already discussed, Sweden, Uganda, which countries from those lists stand out the most to you in terms of the magnitude of their commitment to nuclear?
Oh, it's still China. It's still China for sure. Because their build outs are happening. Most of these announced building plans, like we just mentioned in Sweden and Uganda, that's fantastic. And I think it's wonderful that they're moving that direction. But these build outs for reactors that are expected to grid connect 2030 to 2035 doesn't really mean a lot for this particular contracting cycle necessarily. I mean, if they really get their act together and start building quickly, maybe some uranium demand for first core loads for these announced builds will happen towards the end of the decade. That's possible. But for China, they just say what they're going to do and then they do it. And there's not any NIMBYism, not in my backyard. There's, very little environmental concerns around, pretty much anything that they're doing. But they certainly are seeking to be a global leader in clean energy production, which is great because they are the biggest polluter. And they're still building a lot of coal plants. But as of now, the fact that they plan to hit 150 gigawatts by 2030, and right now I think they're at 55. So what is that, 95 gigawatts, another 90 reactors constructed and hitting the grid in the next 6.5 years. That's insane. That's an absolutely insane goal, and their pace is quickening. So they've had a similar goal for the past couple of years, right? But their build outs, their construction starts haven't been in line with that goal. It's still been by far the fastest growing nuclear country in the world, and it's not even close. But rather than 10 construction starts a year, they've had 5 or 6. They just approved 6 new construction starts last week. So when you look at those numbers, just to put that into context, they hold probably about 25% of the world's uranium reserves in terms of above ground inventory, not in ground reserves, but actual inventory. So, 300 to 400 million pounds the Chinese collectively have held in of U308 equivalent across the fuel cycle. Now, that sounds like a lot of uranium, but let's put that into context. 55 gigawatts of nuclear right now. So roughly that's about 25 million pounds a year that they're consuming of uranium. They produce about 5. But they, 150 gigawatts in the next 6.5 years, that's 70 million pounds of uranium, roughly. I mean, it depends on the enrichment tails, but somewhere in that ballpark, 70 to 75 million pounds per year of uranium demand coming just from China. So that's almost half of the world's demand right now, only from China within the next 6 years. It's truly phenomenal. It's truly phenomenal calculations. And to build that out into models, it's just like it becomes ultra clear that prices need to go significantly higher because every single proposed greenfield project basically needs to get into development in the next 5 years in order to actually be able to be producing enough uranium to support this nuclear renaissance. So it's very, very important that we see higher prices. It's not just, I'm an investor and I want it higher so that I can make money. It's like, well, I actually also sincerely believe in the growth of nuclear for the benefit of humanity, and higher prices are necessary in order to incentivize that new production. And that's just, the numbers coming from China are massive, and they don't have enough uranium domestically. They're having a hell of a time increasing their production. They want to produce a third of their needs. It's never going to happen. And unless and until we have $200 uranium sustained and they can get it from phosphate tails. And at that point, bring it on. So they're going to have to acquire more projects and sign more contracts. That's what we're going to see. More uranium from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan being consumed by the Chinese. I'll bet my life on it. And they're probably going to go after more projects, and it's probably going to be Africa.
So you brought up an interesting point I'd like to dive a little bit deeper on, is that some of these planned reactors are so far out that it might not affect the contracting cycle this time around. So I'm wondering how investors should be taking all of this news into consideration. Should they be factoring in uranium demand from that far out, or is it better to focus on reactor builds and extensions that are in the near future when it comes to the overall thesis?
Well, I think that modeling out, you really only can officially conservatively model out what's actually under construction right now, and you expect to be grid connected when that happens, which is essentially what we're doing. You can make educated guesses on what the demand and supply picture is going to be, let's say in the mid 2030s, when you expect to see 6 more large reactors in France, for example. When you expect to see another 100 reactors in China. I laugh, but that's what they're trying to do. That becomes a little bit more difficult. It also becomes much more speculative and not necessarily even essential to the investing thesis if you're looking at the next 5 years or so. If you're talking about trying to predict what sort of super cycle we might be entering into and get some rough numbers going out, and then go ahead and model that out. But it's very speculative. So to model conservatively, we're really only looking at what's operating now, what is likely to get life extended, what is likely to get shut down, what is under construction currently, and when will that hit the grid. And based on just that, you can get a pretty darn clear picture of what we're looking at demand-wise going out to the end of the decade. And then, of course, you can contrast supply and see the gigantic alligator jaws. So, really what affects this cycle more than anything are these life extensions and restarts. So Japanese restarts primarily, but there are a couple of restarts that are possible. For example, like we mentioned, the restartable reactors, the operable reactors in Germany, will those come back onto the grid? We don't know. Are we modeling out that they will? No, 100% not. Have to be conservative with it. But Japan just restarted its 11th reactor since Fukushima. They should be restarting a 12th this year. Following that, the next one in line is the first boiling water reactor in Japan to be restarted since Fukushima. So hopefully when that restarts, that will lead to more boiling water reactor restarts in Japan. They are looking at actually financially subsidizing to accelerate restarts coming from the Japanese state level, coming from increased increased electricity rates by the ratepayers will actually be supporting accelerated restarts in Japan. Another example would be the Palisades reactor in the United States in Michigan that was shut down last year. And they just allotted $150 million in the Michigan state budget for 2024 to help to restart that reactor. We haven't seen that in the United States before. That's new. So restarts have an immediate effect on supply and demand. And then, of course, life extension. So just for example, just today, the news of a reactor in France. This is the Turkestan reactor. This just got a 10-year life extension in France. This is the first reactor in France to get more than a 40-year operating license. So, I mean, we're seeing this all over the place. And that is something like we actually have to go in and adjust our models because of that decision that was just made and announced today. That's 10 more years for this reactor. And I haven't looked at the numbers as far as its megawatt capacity, but that's probably another 3-4 million pounds of demand from this one restart in France. And now that sets a precedent to be able to extension sets a precedent to extend more reactors in the country beyond 40 years. And it's, that's the way the wind is blowing. And these restarts and life extensions have immediate effect and absolutely affect supply and demand for this particular contracting cycle and the expected time frame for this investment.
Well, political winds do continue to shift, and we've recently seen the Green Party of Canada now stating that they will, quote, cease blanket opposition to nuclear power as a source of low-carbon energy production. It looks like physics has trumped political ideology. So firstly, what's your initial reaction to this change in stance? And secondly, do you think this will eventually, the German Greens are kind of one of the most hardcore anti-nuclear political groups around. I think it's like part of their campaign slogan, nuclear, no thank you. So do you think they will eventually change their stance as well, and perhaps other places that are opposed politically? I believe Belgium is in that camp, Austria as well.
Yeah, Belgium's kind of in the middle. They did recently shut down 2 reactors, I believe that was last year. But the remaining 2 reactors, they are looking at, they've actually already committed to extending the lives of those reactors. And the operator of those reactors is uncovered in terms of fuel because they were expecting a shutdown. So that, again, extension and near-term demand in the market. As far as Canada goes, really loving what we're seeing in Ontario, of course. They've announced they are looking into building, I can't remember off the top of my head, another 6, I think, large-scale nuclear reactors, either 4 or 6, I don't remember, at Bruce Power. And then at the Darlington facility where they're building Canada's first SMR, there's a GE Hitachi BWRX-300. They announced they're shooting to build 4 of those instead of 1. But yeah, just generally speaking, to see a Green Party embrace nuclear, that's just, again, part of this narrative shift. And that's one more piece of that puzzle. The EU also is, including nuclear in its green taxonomy. But what that means for Germany, again, I don't really know. I tend to agree with Doomberg. We had him on our members webinar last month in July. And he basically believes that the United States and multiple other countries are going to have to follow suit with what Ontario is doing. That it's basically just looking at physics, and eventually physics will win. Basically, they were a few years ahead of the United States in terms of an act that they voted into place. I think it was in 2009. I don't recall the name of the act, but it was, multiple subsidies and financial support for expanding on renewables. And then they tried that and it didn't really work. And the Ontarians voted in a different political party, and they shifted their goals. They looked at math, they looked at physics, and they listened to the people. So it's entirely possible. We're already seeing kind of a political wind of change in Germany, in small scales in certain areas of the country. So will eventually, the populace demand that they shift and go back to nuclear. That's possible. It's entirely possible. It's just a matter of time before people really recognize what's working and what's affecting their rates, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I'm in California, for better or for worse. And California has drastically expanded solar PV in the state. So they have a lot of solar electricity in the state of California. They have a decent amount of wind out in the desert east of Los Angeles. And, my electricity rates, I don't have a choice. I have to buy electricity for something called the Clean Power Alliance, which is like a third party that goes through Southern California Edison. My rates have never been higher. They've never been higher. As you know, California extended the life of Diablo Canyon for 5 years. Then only the remaining one nuclear reactor, or one power station, there's 2 reactors there in the state of California, provides almost 10% of the country's electricity, or the state's electricity, and a significant chunk of its clean energy. So we've gone way, way heavy into solar, and my rates have never been higher. Solar is cheap narrative is also falling apart. The wind, we've seen wind energy kind of lose its shine in the last year or so. A number of companies that have been heavily invested in expanding wind energy have either gone bankrupt or have basically publicly stated, we're getting out of this business. The wheels are falling off the wagon in many ways for the renewable energy front. And, nuclear is going to be there to pick up the pieces, and I'm on board for it.
So you mentioned small modular reactors there. I was wondering if you could maybe give us an update, what you're seeing on your end with small modular reactor technology at the moment, and are there any recent developments that have you bullish on that segment of the sector?
Yeah, I'm excited about small modular reactors. I love the general concept. There's pushing 100 different designs that are in the works right now under various stages of engineering and development. There's a lot of momentum for small modular reactors, and I think that they're actually going to have a significant use case, especially in the West, and that has to do with essentially financing. That actually likely is to have more of an influence on the adoption of small modular reactors by utilities in the West, and specifically, the United States, than the benefits of the designs, let's say. So even though there's some big benefits with some of these designs in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of ideally lower cost electricity production, safety elements, walkaway safe designs. Some of these reactor designs do not need water for coolant, so they can operate in dry areas, which is a big change compared to a pressurized water or boiling water reactor. And there's a lot of momentum on that front. So just even if the economies of scale, so going back to like the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, it was moving in the opposite direction. It's like, okay, if we can build a 300 megawatt one of these things, what are the economies of scale if we jump that to 600 megawatts, if we jump that to 1,000 megawatts? And it made sense financially to do so. Now the situation is kind of different. Money is expensive. Interest rates are high. You can imagine with a multi-billion dollar project, you have a 6 month or 1 year or 2 year delay. That gets extremely expensive with, expensive money. So the faster you can build something that you're having to borrow to do so, the more lucrative it could be financially speaking. So I think that's a big reason why we're going to see a lot of interest with SMRs in the West. But of course, the use cases are pretty incredible as well. You have, for example, X Energy signing a number of MOUs with Dow Chemical, looking at producing industrial heat and industrial steam. The Natrium reactor, the TerraPower's Natrium reactor that is set to be built in Wyoming, the first of its kind. It's also one of the 2 reactors that has received Department of Energy demonstration project funding. This reactor is a molten salt reactor. It can actually store excess heat in the form of molten salt, and it can draw on that excess heat to cycle up and down much more readily, much more dramatically than a large-scale traditional light water reactor. So it's kind of an ideal companion for a grid that has a substantial amount of renewables in it. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but let's just say there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of orders for SMRs around the world in various countries. The big part of this that I find exciting from an investment standpoint is that when you model out supply and demand and include zero demand for SMRs, it's still an incredibly striking picture. And still we're looking at much higher prices because of that. So SMR demand is actually just gravy on top. It's not needed for this thesis whatsoever, but it's an exciting new piece of the thesis and piece of the story that we're very, very excited about this. We're watching it very closely. We think that there's going to be many investment opportunities in this SMR space. I think it's going to take off. I personally believe that this will be a big, big global trend into the next decade. It's going to take some time to get off the ground. But yeah, China just installed their first reactor core of their first SMR. So they're building essentially the first one, even though they've technically existed in the nuclear navy for decades. But in the way that we're discussing small modular reactors, China's building the first one, and I think there's many, many more to come.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Justin. A ton of very fascinating information shared. Always love chatting about uranium with you. For those who want to learn more and who aren't aware already, maybe you could talk to us about the Uranium Insider newsletter and what you do there.
Sure. Yeah, and it's always my pleasure, Jesse. Always good to chat with you. Uranium Insider is a uranium-focused, nuclear energy-focused investing newsletter. I've been doing this since August of 2019. We've almost 4x'd our money during that period of time. We've outperformed the benchmark ETFs by a factor of 2.5, and we continue to do our best to provide alpha to our paying subscribers. We produce a 40-page monthly newsletter. We do monthly members-only webinars. Like I mentioned last month, we had Doomberg on. We've had the guys from Segra, the guys from Sachem Cove. We've had Dustin Garrow and a number of industry execs across the industry. So we like to bring those high-level conversations to our members. And basically, essentially what we do is we take all of this somewhat complex and incredibly consistent flow of information and try to distill that into what it means for you as an investor in the space. So in my opinion, if you're long this sector, if you plan to be long this sector and you want to not only have some insight into what we believe are the best risk reward plays in the sector, but keep abreast of what is happening in the sector on an almost daily basis. I also do a nearly daily update videos that are for members only. We think it's essential. It's essential information for investors in this space. So we have a fantastic small team. My primary partner is an ex-hedge fund guy, brings a lot of professionalism and intellect into this particular product. And we're really pumped for what's coming. It's been a long consolidation. We've had almost a 2-year consolidation in the sector, a big reset in terms of valuations for the miners. Finally, the charts are setting up. We're pretty bulled up here, and the fundamentals have never been better. Finally, the technicals are lining up. I think we're poised for a pretty solid run coming up here pretty soon, and going right into what's usually a strong season for uranium. The fuel buyers come back from vacation. We've got the WNA conference in about 3 weeks. We've got multiple fuel cycle conferences in the autumn, and then just looking at the contracting cycle needs and what's happening across the fuel cycle. It's an extremely constructive setup. We're the only newsletter that I know of that's 100% focused on this space. So we live, eat, and breathe this stuff every single day, and love what we do. So looking forward to the next few years in this sector. It's going to be pretty exciting.
Well, I will put a link in the description below to Uranium Insider for those who want to check it out. Thank you once again for joining us, Justin, and looking forward to catching up next time and chatting uranium again.
I can't wait to do it. Congratulations on the growth of your channel as well.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.